Good morning, good afternoon. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and we have a wonderful panel for you today regarding what is Mr. Putin up to in Ukraine. Joining this panel, we have Pavel Felgenauer from Moscow, who is a longtime defense analyst, and he writes for Novaya Gazeta. We have David Kramer from Miami, who's the head of the Florida International University's Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy. And we have Hannah Shelest from Kiev. She is the Security Studies Program Director at the Ukrainian PRISM Foreign Policy Council. So you might say today, since I'm coming to you from Washington, we have a tale of four cities. Hannah, we'll start with you. People have been writing now for several weeks about a possible move by Mr. Putin in Ukraine. There have been now military exercises in the southwestern Russian military district. Are Russian forces building up along Ukraine borders? And what are we looking for?
That is quite an interesting question because you both need to not to overestimate, but not to underestimate what is happening on the borders of Ukraine and at the territory of the occupied Crimea. The question is that definitely for the last 18 months, we saw the significant increase of the Russian forces that have been moved to Crimea. And by the data of the Joint Operational Forces of Ukraine presented in July, currently it is around 32,000 personnel only, not speaking about the significant increase in military equipment, including aircraft and ships being stationed there. From these 32,000, approximately 11,000 is the land component. So it is in addition to the Russian Black Sea Fleet stationed there. So just to imagine the difference, before 2014, the numbers were approximately 17,000. So for the last 6 years, increased almost twice. And for the last 18 months, it was the serious increase in personnel, not only military, but also of the security services. For the last approximately 2 months, we see the additional movements. We see the move of the forces through the Kerch Bridge, and we see the increase of the activities at the eastern borders of Ukraine, not speaking about the constant activities at the northern borders of Ukraine. But why I said that we should not also overestimate sometimes, because immediately in June, July, when these developments started to be visible, so not the preparatory phrase, but the real movements of the forces started, a lot of people started to speak about the immediate attack, that it can be either for water or just for additional territories or to threaten Ukraine. So different reasons were presented. The question is that some of these movements, and especially the latest SNAP exercises, urgent exercises that were just announced, they coincide with the Sea Breeze exercises, the Ukraine-US exercises happening in the Black Sea. And as previous years demonstrated, that Russia always tries to do something at the same time when Ukraine has the exercises at the Black Sea. One of the reasons is to disturb the international exercises. The second is to demonstrate the power. And the third is definitely to present the image of the threat, because it was happening in parallel with the new round of Normandy 4 negotiations and Minsk negotiations. Very often when it was difficult times in these negotiations, Russians demonstrated forces at the borders as to present some kind of the psychological pressure towards the Ukrainian leadership.
Okay, Hannah, thank you for your concise answer. Pavel, you've been watching Kremlin military activities for decades. Mr. Putin called a snap military exercise on July 24. As Hannah pointed out, this is in connection with the Sea Breeze exercise in Ukraine. Or do you think it's simply routine, or could this be a running start for a military operation in Ukraine?
Most likely not. It's not preparation for immediate action in Ukraine, but nothing can be totally ruled out. And to understand Russian tactics on Ukrainian issue, you should very well keep in mind all the time Russian strategic overall intent. and Russian intent has been articulated publicly by Putin many times. He said that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, один народ, or as in German it would be ein Volk, that have to sign the kind, and he believes that they should live in one state, in ein Reich, and maybe there'll be some kind of ein Führer around there. But that means that Russia, there's no real disagreement in the Kremlin or in any parts of the Russian government that that is the overall strategic objective. But there are different ways of achieving it. It's either waiting till Ukrainian state, which is seen as some of an abomination, begins to disintegrate, then we move in to pick up the pieces, or we go in now, not waiting, with guns blazing, and solve the Ukrainian problem once and for all. Okay, so and of course different kind of possibilities in between that. And I believe Putin is a cautious person. Basically, he'll continue to wait for the inevitable, and also put, of course, military pressure, political pressure, economic pressure on Ukraine. There has been in Moscow the elections and the defeat of Mr. Poroshenko was seen as a big deal, that the Ukrainian nationalists are noisy but a minority, that the majority of Ukrainians are kind of proto-Russians. I mean, that's like the attitude of King George III to the American 13 colonies. That they have been good Britons mostly, but there's a malicious patriot minority that should be dealt with. But the problem right now is, of course, that the President Zelensky has now been written off in Moscow, that he was not good for anything and will not produce what Russia wants, some form of beginning of the process of reunification. And that means there is the distinct possibility that at some point we could go in to liberate the Ukrainian people from that nasty nationalistic minority. But I don't think it's coming right now imminently. I don't believe that. But again, that's a bit of a guess.
Okay, thank you. David, there has been speculation in Washington too over the past few weeks about a possible Kremlin military action. We've heard from Han and Pavel that that's probably not likely this summer. But just to play this out one more time, were the Kremlin to strike in some obvious form, some larger intervention, what do you think the reaction in Washington would be?
I think the reaction in Washington would obviously be very negative, but what worries me is that we're not doing much of anything to try to preempt a possible military move. And part of that is a reflection of what I think has been a disastrous policy toward Ukraine since President Zelensky's election. And I think that if you look at the whole policy, there are parts of it that actually have been very good. The decision to provide lethal military assistance to Ukraine, now including beefing up Ukraine's Navy, the participation in the Black Sea training exercise Sea Breeze that just ended yesterday, the statements coming out of the mission in Vienna from the US OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, have been consistently strong and good. And just last week, Secretary Pompeo issued a statement on the anniversary of the Wells Declaration, saying that the United States will never accept the annexation of Crimea and condemning the aggression against Ukraine and Georgia, as well as the parts of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But then when you step back from those things, again, those are positive. The president dragged President Zelensky completely unnecessarily into American domestic politics. He still has not hosted President Zelensky in the Oval Office now. Obviously, it's not the time to do so in light of the pandemic. His lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is still digging up dirt, supposedly, on Vice President Joe Biden. And if President Trump, apparently, according to reports, did not raise allegations of Russian bounties on American soldiers in Afghanistan with his phone call with Putin last week, then he's certainly not going to be raising any concerns about what Russia might do with Ukraine. If he's not going to bat for our own soldiers, he's not going to go to bat for Ukrainians. So I do worry that we are not paying enough attention. Obviously, our focus in the past few months has been on China, taking a very strong stance against the Chinese Communist Party's moves and tactics and behavior, but there has been very little in comparison with the ongoing and consistent threat coming from Mr. Putin. And so I worry that Putin views Trump as weak. The US is divided and badly polarized, preoccupied and distracted, understandably, with the pandemic and the economic situation. The EU in disarray, NATO leaderless. And so to him, the West won't be an obstacle. I think for him, the obstacle would be, could it work in light of what I think is a growing political crisis for him in the Russian Far East that he has to be worried could spread further into the country.
Okay, David, thank you. Well, let me follow up on that last observation and throw another question to Pavel. In light of, I don't want to overstate what's happening in Khabarovsk, although it's very interesting, the ongoing demonstrations, which had over 50,000 again just this past weekend. But if Mr. Putin were to strike in Ukraine, is that something that would help him domestically in political terms?
No, I don't think that would help right now much at all. And yes, there's problems internally in Russia. Well, like most likely in any country hit by the pandemic and by the economic hardships that came with it, then there's a lot of bad feeling within the population. And it's demonstrating itself in riots in the United States, and the same can happen in Russia. I would believe that in such a situation, Putin, who is the ultimate decision maker, and who on a couple of occasions in 14 declined specifically to go into Ukraine with guns blazing, with a massive invasion, not just simply to stop the Ukrainian forces putting down the separatist movement in the Donbass, but just simply going in massively. He decided not to do that. He's a cautious person, and he believes apparently that he can sit it out and wait it out until the fruit is ripe enough to pick. And the internal problems right now in Russia are not really, doesn't mean that we're going in. I think we most likely are not. Of course, what could really trigger any kind of Russian swift movement into Ukraine would be if in Ukraine they'll begin any kind of internal problems. And that there'll be demonstrations there, and another Maidan or something, and then Russia would be very tempted to go.
Very interesting. Okay. The big news last week relating to our conversation, one, the SNAP exercises, but two, the agreement reached in the trilateral contact group in the Minsk process on a full ceasefire, which is supposed to start today. Hannah, I'd like to ask you about this. Do you think this agreement was notable, and will it succeed? Will there be an actual ceasefire, which we have not seen for one day since the war began in 2014?
Yeah, I checked the recent data since January, at least, not speaking about the previous one, because none of the previous ceasefires officially were cancelled, and none of the months has had more than 5 days without two person. We are not speaking about firing. Yep. So, for example, in July, you had only 5 days when we didn't have any Ukrainian soldier being killed. So that is the ceasefire in practice. The ceasefire agreed now, it's much more complicated by what is inside, because it's including not only stopping firing or shooting, but also to stop the intelligence activities and activities of the drones. And that is quite an issue of how it will be implemented and what consequences it can have. But already today, what we heard, the statement of the joint staff was fantastic. Like, there are no violations of ceasefire except of 15 shootings. So my logic at least didn't work with this sentence. So it's either no violations or there are shootings. Still, we understand that it is the first day. We need to see how the developments is going on. What is the negative sign for me? that even that the Russian Federation was involved in negotiating this, immediately at the next day, the press secretary of the Russian president announced that Russia can't guarantee this. So it seems to me that this agreement about the ceasefire and other details that were included there, the most important task was not to agree the ceasefire, but to make the representatives of the separatist entities as the more equal partners in this agreement. And it is very visible both from the formulation, from the wording of the agreement, and from the next explanations done in Moscow. So I'm afraid that it was a little bit of the trap that maybe Ukrainian representatives were caught rather than real intentions from the Russian Federation side to agree and to impose their influence, to influence the separatist representative.
Okay, thank you. Pavel, I appreciate your take from Moscow regarding the significance, if any, of this agreement on the ceasefire.
Well, for the time being, it's working and may work. There were some incidents before when there was actually some ceasefire almost holding, say, in the second half of September 14, maybe in the moving into the first week of October 14. There were ceasefires. They collapsed eventually. And of course, this most likely will also eventually collapse. Again, you should always understand the Russian strategy. As I began with, the Russian strategy is integration of Ukraine long term. And that means any ceasefire is going to be judged, does that help or does it not help in the long run? Right now, most likely it's going to be for some time. And right now, Russia, I don't think that Moscow believes Ukraine is a priority. There are other priorities for the Kremlin. Ukraine can wait on the back burner. And if a ceasefire can help that, that's okay. But that doesn't mean this is because there is really no move right now and no political will in Moscow to move to any kind of real political solution. Zelensky has been written off as a kind of semi-nationalist or something. I mean, he's not considered a person that has the power or the will or the desire to follow Moscow's line. He doesn't want to become a Moscow-led president in Kiev. That means right now it's just a holding tactical operation. Can a ceasefire hold for a time being? If need be, the Russian military can guarantee that there'll be no shooting. They can do that, I mean, it's all controlled there. From both sides, it's a well-controlled situation. It's not some kind of trigger-happy people there. They shoot when they're ordered to shoot from both sides. Right now, there's a decision not to. How long it will last, I don't know.
Okay, Pavel, thank you. I'm struck by your characterization of caution right now on the part of the Kremlin, but also an unyielding goal of reintegration of Ukraine. David, do you think that Washington policymakers, and for that matter, Congress, understands that this is Russia's goal?
I think there's some understanding of it. I think in parts of the administration where you have people who follow the situation very carefully, they understand. I would actually argue that integration may be a goal. I think also destabilization is a goal. And I think this is where Putin's interests don't necessarily match up with what should be Russia's national interests. It's not in Russia's national interest to have a destabilized neighbor along its borders, whether it's Ukraine, Belarus, or Georgia. But it does seem to be in Mr. Putin's interest to make sure that Ukraine is destabilized, that Ukraine doesn't succeed, so that Ukraine does not pose an alternative model as a fellow Slavic nation for what could be in Russia. So integration strikes me as more of a long-term process. I think from 2014 to today, the goal has been more to destabilize the situation in Ukraine. And I do think that there is a good understanding of that, both in the administration and on the Hill. Again, I think the embassy in Kiev, which still is not with an ambassador, a confirmed ambassador, which is something that needs to be rectified, but also in the mission and what's that?
You're talking about the U.S. Embassy.
Yes, the U.S. Embassy, sorry. But also the U.S. mission, the OSCE has done a very good job of highlighting this. My hope on the ceasefire, by the way, and hope is not a policy to be clear, but my hope with the ceasefire is that it might lead to some more prisoner exchanges, as previous ceasefires have. The OSCE mission last week indicated that there are some 80 political prisoners in Ukraine. And so I hope that this ceasefire might pave the way to at least liberate some Ukrainians who definitely should not be held by Russian authorities. I think otherwise the ceasefire is going to be pretty meaningless, like past ceasefires have, going back to Minsk for that matter.
Okay, Hannah, before I turn to you, I want to go back to Pavel to give him a chance to say something here. Pavel, David just described Putin's objectives as destabilizing Ukraine. That need not be inconsistent with your understanding of his objectives, but I want to give you a chance to comment on what David just said.
Oh, yes, basically, yes, because disintegration is a way to remove this abomination of an independent Ukrainian state. Destabilization means the Ukrainian state collapses, we move in, we pick up the pieces we want, most likely not all of Ukraine, the kind of so-called Western Ukraine, Russia does not want, most likely. It's not that we would want them all. But more or less, that's kind of, that has been the agenda even before Putin took over power. I've heard that from Russian top diplomats and others in the Kremlin in the Yeltsin times. So it's a long kind of objective. The trauma of 91 and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and especially of the Slavic republics going away, is still very much alive in the Moscow elite.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, I was struck by Pavel's description of Zelensky, how Zelensky is understood in Moscow as kind of a semi-nationalist. Your take on that and what that means for Ukraine.
Zelensky is completely not nationalistic if you look at him from Ukrainian point of view, even more by the right political parties. He's accused of being pro-Russian sometimes. So in this case, Ukrainians and Russians definitely see the president of Ukraine dramatically different. But I understand from where this perception in Moscow is coming. The issue is that when Zelensky was elected a year ago, his statements were much softer about Russia and about the conflict in the East, about all the development. He was afraid to name Russia as aggressor. You couldn't find in any of his statements, he always said another side, some people, but never said Moscow or Russia as an aggressor. So, but later, because the security situation was not changing and sometimes even became worse, also the negotiations in Paris didn't happen as he expected. So his statements, his approach started to change as well. He realized that you can't satisfy everybody probably, yeah? And if you would like to be president of Ukraine, you need to name things as they are. So his statements became much sharper. He started to support army. He started to say that Ukrainian army would be able to respond, even that he is still eager for compromises, for dialogue, and to separate Moscow, the Kremlin, and people at the uncontrolled territories, because different approaches, different tactics towards these two groups. And because of these actions, and because he was not quick or so eager for those compromises that Moscow wanted, first of all, about changes to the constitution of Ukraine, about federalization of the country, or special autonomous status, or rejecting European Union and NATO future membership for Ukraine. So those red lines for Moscow. Definitely he started to be at least named or blamed to be semi-nationalistic. Why still semi? Because definitely if you compare him with the Poroshenko, he's not that big evil as Poroshenko was for Putin circles, for his team and how they named him. And especially when you can't hide, for example, stop capitulation protest in Kiev. So it's still understandable even for the Russian public that he is a little bit different from the previous president. But for Ukrainians, I mean, we still understand that it is a long way for President Zelensky to feel himself as the president of the country and to be ready and brave enough to name the real threats and risks for the national security.
Let me come at this one more time, Anna. Uh, it's clear that Zelensky has disappointed Putin. Is there a recognition among people who look seriously in Ukraine at the country's security that President Zelensky is in fact learning on the job and doing a better job on this subject, precisely for the reasons why Mr. Putin is disappointed?
15. So he is definitely learning, but learning much slower than needed. That's question number one. Point number two is that if we would have at least the presidential republic, so the president would be in charge of all the processes, and we have only his position and, for example, position of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who are very anti-Russian in their actions and in protecting Ukrainian national interests, it would be one story. But we also had other people in the near circle of the president who are in charge of the negotiations, including his head of the presidential administration and some of his advisors, as previously Mr. Sivoha, that his how to say his their statements and their actions sometimes are undermining this general line and the changes that president maybe is trying to make. So it's still, you can't say that it is coherent changes that would disappoint Moscow.
Okay, I just want to ask one more question along this line because I think it's worth exploring. One thing that President Zelensky did a year ago, which surprised me, and I'm sure surprised the Kremlin, is he seized those ships that were involved in the Straits of Kherson incident. That showed us a remarkable amount of, I think, boldness. Does that have any impact on your thinking, the thinking of others, of a more nationalist-minded view in Ukraine?
The problem is how the return of the ships happened, because if you remember in June 2019, it also was a scandal and the big dispute between the previous Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Klimkin, and President Zelensky, because the Hamburg Tribunal made a very clear decision that Russia needs to release ships and soldiers. So what Russia started to do, they started negotiating and trying to pressure Ukraine that they are ready only to exchange the soldiers and they were no worse about the ships. And at that time, President Zelensky took, unfortunately, not the position of his Minister of Foreign Affairs, but of the Russian Federation. It was more in the Russian narrative, the eagerness to neglect the decision of the International Tribunal. So when the exchange happened, it took yet from September till December, 4 months for Russians to return back Ukrainian ships. So even that maybe later his position was stricter, but I can say that in July, that case is a good example for being to demonstrate the disappointment with the that Putin can have about Zelensky.
Okay. David, I don't mean to neglect you, but I want to go back to Pavel one more time. Pavel, what was the impact in Moscow or the view in Moscow when those ships were seized by Zelensky a year ago?
I mean, the ships were not seized by Zelensky. They were returned to Ukraine, and they were seized by Russia quite before that. And they were returned to Ukraine. And there was a bit of exchanges about what was stripped off the ships, and that was more or less the end of the story. And now this is really forgotten. No one really remembers much about that, neither the general public nor actually anyone. It's already a non-issue, the ships. What's the problem with a year ago, it seemed that Zelensky, with his enormous majority, And Russia saw the defeat of Poroshenko as a defeat of the nationalists. It kind of underlined Russian position that nationalists are only about 25% of the population. All the rest are basically kind of maybe good Russians. And of course, there is a unionist party in Ukraine, the Oppositionный Bloc, OP, and it's in parliament, and it's maybe about has 15 to 20% in the population too. So there are pro-Russian fractions, and there was hope that Zelensky, having control of parliament and of the presidency, can actually boldly move forward in reintegrating Ukraine with Russia, moving kind of like Kazakhstan or something, I mean, moving into Russian direction seriously. Now it's clear that his authority has been diluted. His support has been falling, and even if he wants to do something, he won't be able to deliver the goods that Moscow wants, and he didn't deliver much at all. And that means that he's been sort of written off as a champion as a potential champion of Russia in Ukraine. That means Moscow is going to be looking for someone else, I don't know, Medvedchuk or I don't know whom, but anyway, not Zelensky.
Okay. Medvedchuk, I think it's safe to say, has no real political future. Right. But anyway, that's another matter. All right. David.
Hey, John, actually, should I just jump in on this discussion that you've just had? Whether Zelensky is being discounted and written off or not, whether he's changing his approach and tactics, it seems to me that one of the best things Ukraine has going for itself in defending against any further Russian aggression is the Ukrainian people themselves. Putin has done an amazing job of rallying support among Ukrainians for joining NATO, much higher. It's not astronomical, but much higher than it was before the invasion. He brought Ukrainians together. I know Ukrainians are exhausted from dealing with this aggression for 6 years now, more than 6 years. But they have really been the front line against Russian aggression. And I think if there were to be a new push coming from the Kremlin, I think we would see Ukrainians rally once again. It's about the only country I can think of that twice in a decade went out into the streets and demanded better from their government and the right to choose their own orientation. So the focus on Zelensky and Putin is completely understandable. But let's not forget that I think one of the biggest factors keeping Putin from moving further is Ukraine's ability to defend itself thanks to the Ukrainian people.
David, that was a very timely intervention, so I'm glad you made that point. So, Pavel, let me ask you this question. I agree with David that the seizure of Crimea and the war in Donbass has created a real sense of Ukrainian nationhood among most of the population. Is that at all understood in the Kremlin? When you talk about them seeing 75% of Ukrainians as sort of good Russians, would suggest not. So your impressions here would be interesting.
Well, I'm not Putin's shrink, so I don't know really what he thinks. Apparently not. I mean, it's again, if we turn to the American Revolution, it's like with Lord Cornwallis troops going through Carolina and having lots of guns and uniforms in their wagons because they believed that the American people who just joined the cause and joined the British Army when liberated from those patriots. They were liberating a kind of the American people. And so there's a belief in Moscow that the majority of Ukrainians, if they're not actually pro-Russian, simply want this situation to go away. And more or less, most likely a majority, or just a slim majority, but the Americans during the American Revolution also wanted just simply to go on with their business and all this thing to stop. Yes, there is a hope. And that's what the argument has been of those who said we should not wait, we should go forward, we should press along and go into Ukraine, and then the Ukrainian state collapses, the Ukrainians will be liberated. Putin has refused to do that, believing that that is too risky, that the situation should become totally intolerable in Ukraine, totally destabilized. The people in the streets, civil disruptions, and then Russia may move in as a saving power. But again, I don't know for sure how they're planning it. And is there someone really planning it or just some kind of vision in Putin's mind? That's an open question, but say right, Ukraine, the result is that for 5 years there's no major fighting in the Donbass. There's the border between Crimea and Ukraine is totally peaceful, but nothing is being resolved. The situation is on hold, and I don't see how it's going to be resolved anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, I'd like to have your view here. But now first, I will put out a hypothesis. It's my sense that President Zelensky, in dealing with Moscow, was hoping that he could cut a deal because the Ukrainian people were tired of war. But he found that when he went too far in offering or seeming to offer concessions, there was a strong pushback politically in the Rada and from Ukrainian side more broadly. If you accept what I've just said, uh, is there any hope of a negotiated peace if the Kremlin's position remains as Pavel just described?
Um, his position was a little bit more difficult. He was not thinking only about the tiredness about the war. Because tiredness is, it's coming and going. That is not something constant. It is in the flux. The issue is that he was quite naive about Russia. He thought that his predecessor was too militaristic and too nationalistic, so he was not ready to talk with Putin. If you remember his statements during the election campaign, so President Zelensky even said, let's ask Putin what he wants in Ukraine. And it was really strange after 5 years of war, if you still don't know what Putin really wants, because all his statements were very open, and what he wants with Crimea, it's more than visible. Yeah, you don't need to ask him. So this naivety and absence of the strategy was definitely dealing, but also the pacifistic approach. He's from that part of the Ukrainian society, and you can find it both at elite level, at the common level, in villages and cities in different parts of the country. So it's not regional, it's more of the societal, who are just thinking like, we don't care about the result, we just want peace. We want to return to the pre-2014 situation. We don't want to hear about war. And that is really interesting. He was from the same background, from the same approach. That's why all his statements, all his tactics, because I can't name it strategies, all his tactics was about exchange of people, some services for the uncontrolled territories or at the contact line. So he didn't want to think about army, about war, about conflict as something real. For him, it was also just a news line that he couldn't understand. Only when he started to travel to Donbass, he started to feel that the war is real. Yeah. When he started to receive more information, it was difficult to say that nothing is happening. Yeah. And definitely when he started to see the reaction of the society to some of his initiatives. And that was extremely important because President Zelensky and his team are extremely sensitive to the public opinion polls. So very often, their idea is they're testing them with the sociological surveys or some opinion polls. And the reactions for few of the say like Steinmeier formula, it was a huge reaction. Language issues. So this reaction can be either on the streets or in social networks, doesn't matter. But we really see that he's trying not to send a ball with information by himself, but doing it through the proxies like some of his MPs or advisors, checking reaction, testing it, and then his statements are adjusting or adapting to the public opinion. So certainly he's still with this big pacifistic approach, with a dialogue above all. But we start to hear more and more of his phrases about, the red lines I will not cross, or the security first, that I'm ready for any kind of elections. So his rhetoric is definitely changing according to more, I can say about according to the whole population view, because you still have this approach in the society, but at least according to the more active part of Ukrainian population.
Okay, thank you. Before we turn to audience questions, I want to go off on a slightly different theme. Uh, Pavel, you talked about instability in Ukraine might have Putin speed up his timetable for action there. There's going to be an election on August 9 in the neighborhood. It's going to be in Belarus. And we've already seen some clearly anti-democratic and destabilizing efforts by the authorities to remove their principal opponents, Mr. Lukashenko's principal opponents in the election. We've also seen some serious demonstrations. If things spiral out of control in Minsk, is it possible that Moscow might consider military action there?
Well, for the time being, I think that's not really seems plausible, and Moscow will be not moving in, most likely. But the Kremlin has been increasingly unhappy with Lukashenko. And he does believe that, yes, he kind of was treated like, I don't know, the Romans treated allied kings who ruled fiefdoms, that he can be the king of Belarus for the time being, but then eventually the country becomes Russia. Russian province. Okay, he does not want to do that. He's been flirting with the West. The situation there is becoming increasingly unstable. A destabilization in Belarus is also would be most likely a casus belli for Russia to begin intervening. For the time being, dislike of Lukashenko, of his open desire not to reintegrate Belarus with Russia, yes, but that's not enough for Russia to kind of try and risk a confrontation with Ukraine, with the Belarusian authorities, with their armed forces. If there is a destabilization and the loyalty of the armed forces and the special services of Belarus would be in question, that could be seen as an opportunity and maybe a need to stabilize part of the joint allied state we have, союзное государство we have with Belarus.
Okay, thank you. David, I'd like to get you to come in here. Your thoughts.
Well, I think the West should take a consistent policy, whether it applies to Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, and that is any violation of another country's sovereignty and territorial integrity should incur significant consequences and costs. Obviously, if it were a NATO member, that would be a different thing. Belarus is not. But I think what we have seen play out is growing identity within Belarus for statehood, nationality, and ethnic identity separate from Russia. And any push by Mr. Putin is likely to generate, I think, significant blowback from the population of Belarus. Lukashenko belatedly has tried to portray himself as a patriot defending Belarus's sovereignty and territorial integrity from further Russian encroachment, and yet he's responsible for having done significant damage to Belarus's independence from Russia. And I think Lukashenko has also demonstrated once again, by the way, for those of us who have followed this country for a long time, he is a master at playing the West and Russia off of each other. We saw Secretary Pompeo there earlier this year, standing with Mr. Lukashenko. We should not fall for Lukashenko's games. We should stand with the people of Belarus, just like we should stand with the people of Ukraine, the people of Georgia, and make it clear with our allies, and that also has been something that has been badly damaged, the transatlantic pushback on Putin's behavior, with our allies to make it clear that any move into Belarus will be met with serious consequences.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have questions from the audience. Several people have asked about the possible impact on Mr. Putin's Ukraine policy if Joe Biden wins our presidential election. And might Putin strike in the interregnum between our election and Biden becoming president if that were to happen? So Pavel, your thoughts.
Well, there is an understanding that if Biden wins the election, the Russian-American relations will not get better. But maybe they'll be a bit more stable and predictable. And there may be some room for actually finding solutions to outstanding problems, like Biden already said that he'll be ready to prolong the New START agreement, though that would be technically not easy if it'll have just a couple of weeks to do that, but that's a possibility which could clear the skies a bit in Russian-American relations. No one believes that the Biden presidency will become more aggressive or kind of anti-Russian in Ukraine or in general in the Russian near abroad in a major sense, because there's going to be so much internal problems with the new administration has to deal with. And of course, there's also China. And apparently, not only Pompeo says that Russia could be maybe possibly recruited in the future as an anti-China kind of, if not ally, then partner, or some kind of counterbalance. Not that Russia wants to do that at all, but anyway, there's such beliefs in DC that could be done. So no, I mean, yes, I mean, traditionally, Moscow preferred Republicans to Democrats in government in DC, but it's going to deal with anything that happens.
Okay, thank you. David, do you want to weigh in on this question?
I would say that these days, the Kremlin prefers chaos in the United States, and we are sadly providing lots of that. And I think while a move by Putin into Ukraine between the election and Biden inauguration, if that were to play out, is unlikely, I think it's very important for President-elect Biden, if he is such, make it clear what the reaction of his administration would be and do it publicly. No private phone calls like Mike Flynn to Sergei Kislyak when he was the Russian ambassador, very privately. Do it publicly, as he did with a statement about Russian interference in our elections and Russian hacking just last week. A very public and very firm statement. I think he also should make it clear that he will restore and repair badly damaged transatlantic relations so that the United States and the EU are working very effectively together. And I think finally, he should make it clear that for countries that are fellow NATO member states, that the United States will be there should Article 5 come into play, unlike President Trump 2 years ago when asked about Montenegro by Tucker Carlson, raised all sorts of doubts about the reliability of the United States. So I think it would be a different approach. And I think, I agree with Pablo, by the way. I think Biden will focus on New START, try to get that extended. And I think that would be a positive thing. And won't try to bring the Chinese into those negotiations, because doing so is throwing a monkey wrench into any hopes of extending it.
Okay. We have a question from Ambassador Bill Courtney. He says, does Zelensky perceive that backtracking on reform could at the margin diminish Western support for Ukraine's security? So first, David, I'd like to ask you, do you agree with Bill's assumption?
That Zelensky is backtracking?
No, if Zelensky is backtracking on reform, that could diminish at the margins support from the West for Ukrainian security.
Well, I think we actually have not seen that so far, fortunately, from the United States, with the Sea Breeze exercise that just took place, with the providing of assistance to Ukraine's Navy. The lethal military assistance continues. So I think on the security side of things, this is one area where the Trump administration has done a very good job, particularly compared to the Obama administration. But I think the concerns are more with economic support. There was the agreement with the IMF. The situation with the central bank chair raised lots of concerns. So I actually don't think it would impact as much the security side as it would the economic assistance side.
Hannah, I'd like to also have you look at this question. Do you think that President Zelensky understands that if he's perceived as backtracking on reform, his relationship with the West will certainly be more difficult and might even affect security?
As for now, we don't see that it is an understanding among his team and him personally about the direct connection. And unfortunately, we see several tendencies, as David said about IMF and National Bank. It was very visible. But it is not only these. There were very difficult debates about new media law, for example, in Ukraine. Now, a few people among his MPs started to speak about the new language law, maybe. There are also changes in health reform, at least discussed here, and difficulties with the anti-corruption bureau and a few other, like with the general prosecutor, with the investigation bureau and others. So we definitely see certain tendencies that are not in line with our obligations about the reforms in the country. And by some experts, they're seen as the going back to 2014. Also, it is happening with the few others. With the security sector, the situation is a little bit more complicated. You don't see the very let's say, vivid examples, that would raise the criticism from the Western partners. But we definitely saw several developments that are raising questions at the level of advisors, connected with some internal processes about connected with the Office of Reforms at the Ministry of Defense, connected with firing some people from the Ministry of Defense, so few appointments that raise the questions. So it is, as I said, it is the level of like everybody is looking to each other how it goes further. Because is it just the changes and transformations of the new Minister of Defense, or there are any more serious developments that can really have the implications for the security cooperation? But as for now, definitely we don't see any big steps from Washington, especially the same from NATO. NATO even gave us the status of the enhanced opportunity partner. So that gives a good hope that, as for now, at least the security sector is safe. But when we speak about those reforms that we need to do according to our European Union Association Agreement, here, yes, the questions can come, and the questions about support, microfinancial support, IMF support, they can be on the agenda, well, for a few months at least.
Thank you. We have a question from Ambassador Sandy Versbaugh in the first instance for Pavel. Sandy asked, says, for many realists, NATO should rule out Ukrainian membership in the alliance in order to reassure Putin that a democratic Ukraine integrated with the EU is not a security threat to Russia. Do you think this would, in fact, satisfy Putin? He would agree to such a grand bargain, or would he simply pocket that concession and continue to destabilize Ukraine with a view towards integration?
We already were in this water. I don't know if you have this expression, but in 2013, the public support for NATO integration in Ukraine was only 13%. And at least a few first months, there were no words about NATO integration at Maidan revolution happening in winter 2013-2014. So at that, and even more in our national security strategy, military doctrine, and all other documents, Ukraine had this non-block status. So these didn't stop Russia from trying to annex Crimea and from starting attack on the east. That's why, at least in Ukraine, nobody believed anymore that if Ukraine would take the neutral status, I mean legally neutral status, and just seek the European Union integration, it would prevent any developments and any aggression from Moscow's side.
Thank you. Pavel, your views on this question?
I would agree with that. Basically, yes. I mean, neutral status, that's good, but not enough. European Union, as it was just said, it was an attempt by Ukraine to sign and then not to sign this association agreement with the European Union was actually the trigger that led to the downfall of the Yanukovych regime and the Maidan, and then Russia used the destabilization to move in and grab pieces. As maybe it's so that's not enough. True reintegration of Ukraine should be more than that. European Union is just another vehicle of Western aggression, basically as seen from Moscow. Though, of course, there is the example of Finland, that is not NATO member, but a European Union member, and Sweden. But right now, Finland and Sweden are not very good examples because they're closely integrating their military with NATO. So that's not going to work, I'm afraid.
David, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I know Sandy was not advocating this position, but any Western leader who would propose this, I think, should be roundly condemned. Unless Ukraine decides it wants to pursue this path, and we saw what happened when Yanukovych tried, that didn't work too well. Ukraine, as Hanna said, Ukrainians want to join. And I can understand why, after they've been attacked and invaded by Russia. That tends to drive up support for joining a defensive alliance that would provide assistance in a time of need. So I think it's a horrible idea. It's selling other countries out in pursuit of a futile effort to strike a deal with Putin, who will never be satisfied and instead would view it as weakness on the part of the West.
I would also add that Russia's invasion of Ukraine partly explains why Sweden and Finland are cooperating much more with NATO on defense matters. Okay, exactly. We also have a question from Ambassador Herman Cohn. He asked, would it be too late for a win-win deal regarding Crimea along the following line? Russia gives Crimea back to Ukraine, and in return, Ukraine gives Russia a 100-year lease on the naval base. I'll start with you, Pavel.
No, I don't think that's going to work at all. Won't work both ways. Russia right now is not, at least in the present situation, not giving back an inch of Crimea. It's now being voted and written down as part of the Russian constitution that it's totally illegal. It's treason to even begin talking about handing back Russian territory, and Crimea right now, under the Russian acting constitution, is Russian territory. So no, that's not going to work, I'm afraid.
Okay, Hanna, do you want to talk about this from a Ukrainian point of view?
Good question, because this idea was already expressed even by some Ukrainian experts and received very negative reaction in the society. But the reason is that, again, we can make a parallels with the previous steps. Let's remember the agreement that President Yanukovych signed, so-called Kharkiv agreements. Even in violation of Ukrainian constitution, he prolonged the stationing of the Russian Black Sea Fleet till 2042. So as you can imagine, from 2013 till 2042, it was more than enough time for any kind of changes. Again, it was not enough for Russia, because we perfectly understand that Russia is important from the strategic military point of view for Russian army, yeah, for sure, for Navy especially. But at the same time, there are much more in Crimea than just a military base there. So especially for the last 6 years, more and more they are manipulating with their ideas of the Russian history there, of the Russian glory there, of the a lot of the narrative that is not Ukrainian or Crimean type of the world. So it became a part of the big puzzle of the Russian identity, of the great Russian identity, that would be very difficult just to say, let's give up and let's just have a military base. Because in this case, it was possible, as it had been done, to finish constructing of the Navy bases in Novorossiysk and a few other developments that they started when President Yushchenko, so let's say back to 2006, said then that he's not going to prolong Black Sea Fleet stationing.
It's now 1 o'clock, the witching hour. So Hanna, you've had the last. Oh, Pavel, do you want to say something?
Oh, it's not. The problem is that, base, what do you mean by base? Russia needs not only Sevastopol, it needs a lot of other installations all over Ukraine. Airfields in the north of Crimea, in the steppe parts, in Guardeysk and other places. Missile positions in different parts of Ukraine aiming at the Bosphorus, and others aiming at, say, at Romania, and American bases in Romania. It's not, Russia does not, present does not want just one base there, it wants the whole thing. And it has it. And there's no incentive to right now, apparently, they would give it back at least under the present regime.
I guess that will be the last word. I'd like to thank everybody for listening in. I'd like to thank our speakers, Hannah, Pavel, and David, for a wonderful conversation. And I'd like to invite you all. We're having a conversation almost happening in Habarovsk on Thursday morning, so please tune into that too. So thank you all for being with us today, especially our speakers.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jim.